pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us today for this interview as we
Thanks for
celebrate
having
our
me.
CKA 10th anniversary. It's a real honor to speak with you about leadership today. Let's get started. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing. I understand you grew up in the Los Angeles area, and you spent much of your younger life in Southern California. Share with us about your younger life experience.
Sure. So I was born in New York, raised in LA, and growing up in LA was a blessing. First, my local team was the Lakers, the greatest professional sports franchise in the world. Second, LA is known for being the largest concentration of people living outside of their native country for something on the order of like 100 plus countries. So that means if you embrace the city and you would be exposed to an incredible variety of cultures and inarguably the best array of ethnic foods in the world. So when I think about my personal experience being Korean American, I would say it was comfortable without a lot of drama. And I think that's a blessing. Pasadena, where I grew up, didn't have a large population of Koreans, but I had so many Korean friends from all over LA. I always felt very tied in. I had a close group of pretty diverse friends at school and a very close group of Korean American friends outside of school. So I grew up proud to be Korean American and somewhat oblivious to the racial tension, simmering in the city because the suburbs were relatively open, accepting, and sheltered. And I never realized how unusual that experience was until I started to meet Korean Americans from different parts of the US. And if you
Hmm.
grew up in a small town with few Koreans, it can create some deeper struggles around identity and very formative parts of your upbringing. And so I realized my experience in LA was just very positive. I never had to explain what it meant to be Korean. I was rarely the first Korean anyone had met. And I never thought of my heritage as, anything but a positive. I live in a city where it's majority minority. And so everyone's got some kind of heritage. You explore it. And it was an interesting time. I know there was a um, good question around model minority and how that fit in. And I think when an entrepreneur mashes up against the model minority myth, you get kind of a weird chip on your shoulder.
Hmm.
So because I excelled academically and played the piano and violin and came from a home of two doctors, I felt like a walking billboard for the model minority, and it was really annoying. So it actually pushed me to throw myself deeply into sports and into theater and to being well-rounded and social is kind of my way of bucking the stereotype. And I think my personal journey growing up was a transition of, you're younger, you're trying to fit in, and then as you get older, you're trying to stand out. And then when you get as old as I am now, you simply don't care what other people think. And I kind of like that last state of mind the best.
So you must have lived through the LA riots. You may have been maybe in college or outside of LA at the time, but do you recall the LA riots and what kind of impact it had on you?
Oh yeah, I was in business school at the
Mhm.
time, and well, by that time, I was an adult and I was more aware of the racial tensions between Koreans and blacks
Mhm.
in LA, and there was so much anger, I think, in the black community after years of systemic discrimination and poor treatment by the justice system. And you had this event and you had a mob looking for a target, and there isn't much space between like South Central and K Town. I mean, it's not a long walk.
Yeah.
Uh, so Korean businesses were the nearest target, and I think that's where a lot of frustration was released.
Mm.
Not on necessarily who they were frustrated
Yeah.
against, but
Yeah.
the nearest target
Yeah.
uh, in distance. And I honestly spent zero time in South Central growing up. It's not an
Mm.
area, pretty high. I think I had the highest murder rate of any major city
Yeah.
at some point. So it was a place where your parents said that's not where you go to hang out,
Yeah.
and nothing's going to bring you into that neighborhood unless you go to USC. Uh, so, but after returning to LA after business school, I spent a fair amount of time in downtown LA and in South Central on weekends via Love LA, which is an outreach program at my church. And that was eye-opening. And um, I think we're in a better place since the LA riots. We have more Korean Americans in city and national politics. We have more elected officials in policymaking positions. We have more Korean Americans with their own platforms that can speak out, whether it's from the arts or journalism. But it's pretty obvious we have a lot more work ahead of us.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the US is a fantastic country, but we're a hot mess right now. And the last few years have been like the Twilight Zone. So everything that bubbled to the surface has always been there. And it's about time we dealt with it because, you know, we're Neanderthals and we zig and zag through moments of civility. But I think if you put Korean Americans in perspective, you have to keep in mind Koreans really only came in numbers after the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which kind of abolished race-based quotas for Europe that favored Europeans and, you know, Caucasian countries, and it created a more merit-based criteria for entry. And I think there couldn't have been more than a few thousand Koreans in 1960 in the U.S., and then hundreds of thousands came shortly thereafter. And my parents were fresh out of medical school in Korea, and then they did their residencies in New York and came over in the very first wave, where like my mom was probably one of 10 women, Korean American women in New York City, like at the time, which my dad was like, okay, we're going to get married right away because like 20 of my friends want to date you because there's 300 of us and 15 of you, whatever. So, and I was, you know, one of those early Korean Americans born and raised in the 70s. So I can name 1,000 Korean Americans born in the US 5 years after me. I can't name 5 born 5 years before me. So, and I just mention this because there's a dynamic. It takes time to climb the ladders of your respective industry. And it's not easy to do that when English isn't your native language. And we had some 1.5 generations did really well. But, you know, my experience when I was graduating from college and the industries I was looking at, there weren't partners that were Korean American, right? There weren't, you know, now, you know, the community was just too young. And, you know, now when I think of the 70s and, you know, born there, you've got people now in their 40s and 50s. And I think we as a community right now are hitting our prime. We've got a vibrant first and second generation are still really close to their roots. We've got a lot of success stories in music and film and TV and politics and business and fashion. So I'm excited that my kids can look around.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of role models. And that's awesome. And Korea itself, I'm living in Korea now, and it's an economic powerhouse that's developed like every 10 years, it's transformed. Developed incredibly fast. So that, and the ties between Koreans and Korean Americans are really strong. Yeah. And that can lead to some really interesting things down the line. So I think the table's set. And now it's up to organizations like CKA to align our various leaders and get to work. There's a lot of work ahead, but I think we're positioned now to do things that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we weren't able to do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we're living in many ways could be the golden age for the Korean American community, because there are a lot of examples, and certainly our second generation, 1.5 second generation, I often call this the bridge generation, because we have one foot in the immigrant generation, right? The sacrifice of our first generation, the identity, the culture, the history, the resilience, you know, those values, basic values that we all learned as growing up. But we also have one foot in mainstream America, right? Understanding not only the opportunities, but also some of the challenges, right? And what we need to do to address some of those issues so that we can move our community forward, right? So absolutely. I wanted to, I'm curious a little bit about your also just early parts of your career. I mean, if you look at your career, you know, you graduated from college, you went to business school, and you did consulting and M&A and things like that. And then you immediately went into innovation, right? Internet, you became a serial entrepreneur at a very early age, you know, early part of your career. And I'm wondering, as a Korean American, what were some of the influences in your life that helped prepare you for really kind of that launching into becoming not only an entrepreneur, but seeing at an early part of your career the importance of how technology and internet would transform entire industries. Were there particular influences or anything that um, that shaped you?
Well, when I was a kid, my career goal was to be a Laker.
Hmm.
And then I quickly realized that requires talent and physical abilities I didn't possess. So I had to go to option two. And when I was like, God, I was probably 10 or 11 when it just clicked for me that I wanted to be an entrepreneur.
Hmm.
So when we think about in college, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. In high school, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. Um, my plan was always to get like 2 or 3 years of experience in business so I could learn as much as I can and be a sponge and soak things up at a larger organization or a vantage point where I could see kind of strategy and operations and execution and then just go do my own thing. And kind of that was the plan out of college. And that
Mhm.
was pretty much what I went after. Um,
Was that because of your parents encouraged you to do that, or is that because you had successful role models that were entrepreneurs, and you said, "Boy, I want to be like him or her someday"?
I honestly have no idea why I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. My parents hated the idea of me going into business. They said right above cockroaches are politicians and business people, and professors are at the top. In their mind, it's
Yeah.
a very Confucian setup. So they really didn't like me going into any kind of business.
Hmm.
They said, why don't you find a cure for cancer? Why don't you go into medicine? Why don't you do medical research? Why don't you become a professor? What a waste of a brain to just make money and be in business.
Hmm.
And, um, it's kind of a very first generation 1950s mindset.
Yeah.
And so I have no idea. Maybe it's just a rebelling against your parents. They want me to go one direction, so I'm going in a different one. But uh, I guess for me also, I had a really active imagination growing up. So I, love comic books and fantasy and sci-fi and read vociferously since I was like 3 or 4 years old. And
Hmm.
so for me, it was imagination. And
Hmm.
the idea of being an entrepreneur is to create something that didn't exist. Like imagine it in your mind and then make it reality. And that dynamic was really exciting to me. Like there's all these problems looking for solutions. Can you solve it in a way that's creative and better and eventually at scale and transform an industry? And I think in my parents' generation, work, their experience with business was big business troubles. And it was like, oh, you know, it's work for compensation as opposed to when you think of an internet entrepreneur, you think, I can change this part of the world by creating something,
Hmm.
right? And have an impact on hundreds of millions potentially of people. So the notion of affecting change was at the heart of me being an entrepreneur. My parents didn't really understand that business was a vehicle for change. I thought, if you're going to spend 40, 60, 80 hours a week working, don't you think it should be a good experience? Don't you think it should enrich your life? Don't you think it should be positive as opposed to clocking in time?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to create a company that was fun to work with, where we made a difference in the world around us. And so the internet um, fit the bill because I was a geek. I love
Hmm.
gadgets, love technology. It was kind of weird being the only guy with email because it's pretty useless, but you could see the potential,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yes.
So I thought low cost, ubiquitous infrastructure for communication, collaboration, commerce. I was like, dude, that's going to change the world. If I'm going to be an entrepreneur, it's the one place where being young is to my advantage,
Yeah.
right? Back when I was in the internet, if you weren't in your 20s, they said, you don't understand this, right? So I was like one-eyed in the kingdom of the blind and, started 7 internet companies in 7 years through an incubator called Castling Group I co-founded with John Suh and,
Hmm.
um, jumped right in. So, and had a ball.
Yeah. Well, certainly, your name is most synonymous with LegalZoom. You became the founder and not the founder, but the CEO at an early part stage of the company, and you brought it up to becoming market value of larger than $2 billion. And Fast Company called it the world's 50 most innovative company in 2012. Um, Walk us through that stage of your career at LegalZoom. How did you evolve as a leader as you were taking it from an early stage of this company into this basically unicorn of a large multi-billion-dollar company?
Sure. Um, so after I'd done my stint at Castle Group and we set up all these internet companies, I was on sabbatical. And I had been on the board of advisors of LegalZoom when it was founded because I'd known one of the co-founders, Brian Lee, from like we were kids at summer camp together. And Brian did some Jedi mind trick. And he tricked me into ending my 2-year sabbatical. And somehow I ended up working as executive chairman and then CEO of LegalZoom. And what I thought was going to be like a quick stint to help out a friend ended up being like a 15-year journey. So we grew from like, a few dozen people to, 1,000+ employees. We created the first legal brand that 70% of adult Americans recognize. And LegalZoom's mission is to democratize law. So we're creating flat fee legal services for the most common legal needs of small businesses and families. I'm really proud of everything the team accomplished and, amazed. We did it, old school. We did it on $1 million of capital. We raised about $1.8 billion of secondary to, help with shareholders and, founders, investors, et cetera. But we grew the company on like a shoestring budget. So it was quite the experience. It was fun, and we went public 6 weeks ago or so.
Yeah, wow.
And so it was a nice bookend to the journey.
Yeah, I mean, not only were LegalZoom known for obviously its rapid growth and really disrupting an industry, but also its culture of innovation, and also just known for just this unique, important ecosystem that you built in terms of being a leader with your leadership team. How did you? I mean, tell us a little bit about your philosophy of leadership when you're running the company, and how did you build this culture of innovation, especially for for other people who are trying to build organizations? What kind of suggestions would you offer them when you're if they want to build a culture of innovation, a company that can grow rapidly like LegalZoom has?
My advice to an entrepreneur or leader is to be wary of the stage that you're at, because your leadership style has to match that phase, and then it shifts as it grows. So when you're in startup mode, you do whatever it takes. You one day you're taking out the trash, the next day you're setting up a call center, next day you're managing some coders for the first time. You're jack of all trades, and you're a player on the court, right? So you're part player on the court, part coach of the team. Right? But you're hands-on and doing everything. And that's really good in those first 50 employees, kind of that startup mode. However, as a leader, you have to shift gears when the organization reaches a few hundred people. Then coaching becomes a full-time job, right? And you can't be a player on the court, because a coach that says in the last second of the game, I'm going to sub myself in and take the shot, is saying terrible things about their faith in the team. And you don't get great talent when you constantly are executing. You're actually, my job was really to identify talent, create small teams with appropriate mix of skills, and then develop the human capital of the organization. That's a huge part of the job. And then strategy, goal setting, driving change becomes the other critical aspect. So if I compared myself as a leader at the start, at the end of LegalZoom, totally different styles. You have to just switch gears. And there's a moment it's pretty obvious when you have to switch. And I think of myself now versus in the early days, I'd say I listen more, talk less. I spend 90% of my day doing what I do best and very little time on doing all the things I suck at. I also believe life is too short to not work with people that you really enjoy their company. People say don't work with friends. I always work with friends. I make new friends at work, but like people that I know and trust, they're talented, that I already have a pre-existing relationship, lets us move faster. And we all make compromises in business because you got to get work done and hit a project on a specific timetable. but I'm at this stage in my career, I'm far less willing to compromise.
mm,
So I'd rather push the timetable out till we get the right talent in place
mhm,
and make sure that mix doesn't have like that person's really talented, but they're quirky in a negative way,
mm,
might bring down the mood. And I'm like, then skip.
mm.
And I think when I was younger, I was like, you had me at amazingly talented. We'll figure it out. Right.
Right,
And you
right.
get a hodgepodge. But then some people, they're not good in teams or they sap the energy. I like quirky. I like strange. I like eccentric, but not when you can't communicate to the people around you,
Mhm.
and not when I can't unlock the value, and not when someone's attacking,
Yeah,
right? Where the chip on the shoulder is so big they can't get stuff done.
yeah.
So when that happens, I just skip. And when I was younger, I was always drawn to the talent,
Mm, mm,
and said, I'll make it work.
mm,
Now I'm like, you know what? That's a lot of work to make it work.
mm. Well, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about your experience with Netcal. One of the things that we'll be celebrating at our upcoming gala is the coming together of CKA and Netcal. Um, Tell me a little bit about how you got involved with Netcal. I know you were part of some of the early classes, but how were you introduced to Netcal, and how did you find the experience at Netcal for you personally?
I forget. Someone reached out to me about Netcal, and I thought it was to join the board of Netcal. It was to be a fellow. And I'm like, what is this? It's a leadership program for people later in their careers. And it was kind of like an interesting concept, but I love Netcal 3 and 4. That was kind of the cohort that I had. And
Hmm.
it's just great friends sharing unique experiences like going to North Korea
Hmm.
together that created all these once in a lifetime moments. Um, and what impressed me is I saw a lot of leaders in a pretty diverse set of industries stepping up, investing their time, their energy, their resources to create change. And NetCal reinforced my confidence that the next generation of leaders in the Korean American community have the skills and the desire to take it to the next level. And it was fantastic. It was a little bit odd because we didn't have one goal, right? It wasn't like, oh, NetCal wants to put this person in office or achieve Y or Z. It was, let's get a group of people together that are civic minded, talented, and willing to give. And whatever you're doing in life, maybe one or two of the fellows have some relevant experience or can assist in some way. And it ended up being like an enabling vehicle to get a lot of different things done, depending on where your passion and interests were. And because you had a close relationship with them, you're like, yeah, if I can help, let's see. And there's such a diversity of skills. There was always someone there you could tap, and that in itself was different for me. Usually, when I do a nonprofit, it's like, well, we want to, help um, children in this situation or families that have been afflicted with X, or so it was very goal oriented, and this was actually much more of an enabling vehicle.
Hmm.
And I think that's why it survived and flourished,
Hmm.
because it was based on just close relationships, trying to get something done, but not being prescriptive about it.
So, what is it about being Korean American you think provides a good basis for being good leaders, or did you find you mentioned that it was very empowering to be a part of this community? Was it the fact that was there any aspects about the culture, or what was enabling about being a part of this community?
I think entrepreneurs and leaders need a set of values, and you can have so many different styles. You can be outgoing, you can be introspective, you can be bombastic, you could be like philosophical. There's just so many styles that I've seen succeed,
Hmm.
but the values at the core of it is different than style. And I think Korean American values are around grit, tenacity, and patience. I think are some defining characteristics of being Korean. Like Bali's not enough; it's got to be Bali Bali.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think these qualities serve you well as an entrepreneur and as a leader, right? To just keep going at it till the job is done. That when trouble and you're going to encounter trouble. You're going to encounter crazy ups and downs. That when you're down, you pick yourself up and you move forward, right? You don't wallow. You don't think, why is me? You get up and you get back to the job.
Mhm.
And I think Koreans just have that deep chip on our shoulder. And I think it can be negative, and I won't go into all the negative parts, but the positive part of it is I think we can look at adversity and go, yeah, experience worse, not so bad. Let's figure it out.
Mhm.
And I think it's a healthy attitude towards creating change.
Yeah. So not only were you an alumni, but you decided to be a board member of Netcal as well. And you must have seen some tremendous value in the continuation of this leadership program for future generations. So I'm wondering what your hopes are for the Netcal program as it moves forward into the future. Where do you see the important potential for Netcal as it takes on its next chapter?
I think the core of Netcal, outside of creating these relationships and bonding during your training, is the actual training itself. So leadership is the job. And when you're a leader, your mistakes as leaders get compounded throughout the organization. The larger the organization, the more your failures and faults get compounded. So if you make decisions rashly and quickly change directions, and now you're managing 500,000, 2,000 people, and they're going, what's going on? You're no longer that fighter pilot that can, do wheelies and turn upside down. You're more managing a large ship. So I think all of these character flaws get compounded. If you're anger and short, you create that tone at the top. So I think it's really important that we focus, excuse me, on developing our skills as leaders to minimize those faults from compounding and making sure our strengths compound throughout the organization. So I think NECA has a great curriculum for leadership.
Hmm.
I think Greg Patton is an amazing teacher. I think he developed a fantastic program for Netcal. I actually was really impressed and brought him in to train my top 200 people at LegalZoom. And he actually trained our folks every year, would come back and keep longitudinal track of our leaders. And so I think in addition to just maintaining the relationship between leaders at a personal level of kind of loyalty and friendship, it's the work of trying to become a better leader actively, not like school before you really have leadership, like responsibilities. It's like, let me train you how to swim before you jump into a pool. And I'm like, well, a lot of the training is more effective once I'm in the pool, right?
Yeah.
So I think leadership's like that. And NetCal as a program for leaders that are actively leading, the lessons learned are much more relevant and hit home and can be put into action and have greater rewards in a shorter time period. So that's where I want to continue to refine that program and get more people through it. Because I think the better we are as leaders, the more effect we'll have on the community at large.
Yeah. And I would even argue that it also, with each subsequent class, it provides mentors, right, for future classes, right, and role models that people can, each generation of cohorts of class can learn from each other, and so forth. And I'm wondering, just from mentorship, and you've also written about mentors as well. And I think Netcal, as I mentioned, can provide important mentors. I'm wondering, how do you find good mentors, and what is how can how can you be a good mentor, and how can you find a great mentor? Is a question for you.
Sure. So I'm a bit of a go with the flow kind of guy. I've had a lot of mentors throughout my life, but I trust that fate, divine intervention, luck brings different people into your life. And then you have to have the self-awareness to connect at that moment and make the most of it. And maybe that connection leads to mentorship, but I let it happen organically. Like, I don't actively seek, oh, this is the person I want to mentor me in my career. I've never been that. It's just kind of, as I've looked and I'm trying to accomplish something and need advice, and I ask people, who do you think could give me insight to this? Then sometimes there's just a personal connection that happens, and I go, hey, this is a person I'd love to have in my life in the next 10, 20 years where they can really help. And you have different mentors at different times. They take on active roles. And for me, it's when that moment happens, you have to have the awareness to follow up, to connect, to figure out common ground, and nurture the relationship, because it gets seeded all the time, right? But these moments, sometimes you go, wow, I missed that moment. Like that would have been a great person. And you drop the car, life gets busy, you don't connect. So for me, it's actually a pretty organic process. I don't really have a prescription to it, but it's being aware that, in life, you're going to come across incredibly talented people all the time. And me, knowing that I was going to be an entrepreneur, just collect talent. Or like, it doesn't make sense. Like, oh, this person's an amazing musician. I was like, really? Tell me about that. Like, what got you into what? Why do there's millions of people that want to be a rock star. Why do you think you made it? Or there's millions of people that want to like do art for a living or be an actor and get paid. How did you do that? And so for me, it's just interesting what brought people to their relative success in their fields, and then connecting with them around that. And then somewhere 10 or 20 years down the line, something happens and you're like, hey, I'd love to connect with that person. And you've had enough of a relationship that you can get stuff going. And some of them are older, some of them are younger. Some of the older ones become mentors. Some of the younger ones become mentors. The mentor-mentee relationship isn't age or experience. It's learning. And I think that framework of just learning from the people around you, sometimes it gets into this traditional mentor-mentee, but most of the time it's just people trying to figure stuff out that connect and enjoy each other's company. And we learn from each other. I learn from my team. I hope they learn from me, but I know I learn from them. And I think mentor-mentee is deciding you're going to learn, right? But I think that's not a decision for one person. It's a decision for life.
Well, thank you for that wisdom. Well, as a final question, as a recipient of CKA's 2021 Empower Award, the award represents honoring a leader that has accomplished, whose life's work demonstrated great leadership, service, role modeling for the Korean American community. And I wanted to ask you as a final question to actually offer a challenge to our Korean American leaders who are watching this interview with us. If you were to give them one piece of advice or wisdom or even challenge for the community in this current environment that we're living in, what would that be?
I would say pay it forward. So there's this notion in life like, oh, I'm going to make a ton of money and focus on my career and then give it all at the end. I don't think life necessarily works that way. You got to give throughout the process. And mentor-mentee is kind of similar. So a lot of people, when they're younger, are saying, well, I've got to absorb. Let me ask a favor of this. Let me ask for advice from here. And so it's a lot of asking. And what I would say is a challenge is get in the habit. So many people help me throughout my life. But wherever you are and you think you're here trying to get here, there's someone here trying to get to where you are. So as much as you've been helped by one person or one group, that in the next 60 days, you help someone else and pay it forward immediately. Like, don't get into this accumulation of debt and then thinking later I'll disperse it, in my retirement. I think it's active that we as a community are constantly pulling, and there's this, people think it's a continuum and there's one end here and one end there. But I think wherever we are in life, there's someone here and there's someone ahead of us and somewhere behind us, and we want to pull everyone with us. As much as you want to move forward, you want to pull the group. And I think you have to do that constantly, not in phases, but constantly. And as an entrepreneur, you think, no, all I got to do is build my business. I've got no time to give favors. I got no time to give back. I was like, but you have time to ask. And I think that's where we can create something amazing when even in the midst of it. Most people realize in your whole life, you're always busy. You're never like, I got so much time in the world. Well, Okay, forget a pandemic with lockdowns, because I think everyone had some free time on their hands. But back before the pandemic, you could go, wow, my last 20 years have been busy. So what does that mean? You're deferring all of this. For when? For never. So my challenge would be give back 60 days and get in the habit of it. No matter, yes, you're busy, everyone's busy. But if you get in the habit now, we as a community, I think, are going to be better off.
Wow, what a powerful challenge to our community to give back and do it regularly and do it often. And so thank you for that. Well, John, thank you for your time. And we really appreciate you sharing your life with us, your career with us, as well as just being a tremendous role model for our community and someone that we can not only learn from, but also we can aspire to be like someday as well. I want to be just like you, John, when I grow up.
No, you want to be
Uh,
way better than me. But thank you so much. It's quite an honor. And I'm humble. Thank you.
all right. Well, thank you.